Architects of bail-in deposit theft behind RBA power grab. And Assange's persecution is all about protecting lies. Coming up on today's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 8th of February 2024. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robbie Barwick. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, we're going to be talking about the real agenda behind RBA independence. It's to make the RBA completely beholden to international financial authorities.
So nobody can stop them when they order your deposits to be stolen.
That's right, among other things. And then we're going to update things on Assange's case. There's upcoming events that we need people to get along in terms of supporting his final appeal against extradition coming up soon.
And Assange's whole work, the Assange that everybody knows, has been about exposing lies to the truth, and we've got a couple of lies that we're going to debunk today as well.
Yes, there's context for that. Now, we have a couple of updates before we get into the main show, but don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, and ring the notification bell when you do so that we'll be able to alert you of any new material, new shows coming out. Share it as widely as you can on social media, make a comment below. It all helps to get the word out, get more people following our messaging here. And also, please donate if you can to support everything that we're doing. You can find a link in the information box below.
Yeah, that includes, there's a hearing in the bank closures inquiry in South Australia in a few weeks, that we're going to that. Then there's a sitting of Parliament at the end of the month, we're going to that. And then there's another hearing mid-March over in Western Australia at Tom Price. Actually, that's going to be quite a haul. We're going to that. We're responsible for this inquiry, and we're determined that it's going to be a successful inquiry. That's why we're quite hands-on this. And as the chairman of the committee acknowledged when we testified in December, he thought it was worthwhile noting that the Citizens Party's participation is entirely funded by the Citizens Party. We're not getting government funding to do this, and that comes from our supporters. So
yes.
Any help you can give us is very valuable.
Now, on our banking campaigns, there's some interesting updates. The issue of bank closures and cash is getting a lot of attention, which is good.
Yes. Well, there's been an enormous amount of attention this year. So in the last week, I've been on a whole bunch of interviews, including I'm becoming a bit of a regular on 6PR in Perth with Ollie Peterson, and 5AA in Adelaide with Matthew Pantelis. So they and what used to happen, Elisa, was we would put out a press release on an issue on the latest news to do with this bank closure stuff, and they'd respond to the press release and say, "Can we interview?" Now they're not waiting for press releases; they're calling. So there's something happens, and they say, "Who are we going to call?"
Yeah.
Bank busters, Citizens Party. So they call up and say, "Can we interview you on this?" And this relates to things we talked about already, like the Bank West closures in Western Australia, where some poor guy in Latham had to drive 130 kilometres to withdraw $300 in cash, and he wasn't allowed to. And Bank West is going fully digital. In the case of Adelaide, the Commonwealth Bank is closing the Rundle Mall branch, and Rundle Mall is an incredibly busy, it's the busiest place in Adelaide. 800,000 people go through Rundle Mall a week, as if that's not a patronised branch, but they're closing it. So they wanted to talk about that. And the Matthew Pantelis, the host of the show, he opened with quite a good screed about what needs to be imposed upon the banks as conditions. And I said to him in the interview, we'll put an interview link to the interview below, I said to him, look, you need to make that as a submission to this inquiry, because just to remind viewers, submissions are open again until the 29th of February, the end of this month. and if it hasn't dawned on you, 29th of February is because it's a leap year, right? This is only 4 Februaries, 1 in 4 Februaries has a 29th, so it's this month. And we need the viewers to help us spread the word on that as well. There's lots of closures happening. Everybody who's upset about it, get them to make a submission. So you must make a submission. Let's for the rest of the month flood this with submissions. So I was able to make that point, and
Pantelis actually advocated for a postal bank in his little screed.
No, he did, as one of the solutions.
And then Bob Katter had a couple of things to say, which was in the media yesterday about cash, which was interesting.
There's nobody like him, is there?
No.
The great, the
legend.
truly great, the legend, the man, the myth, the legend, Bob Katter. So Bob goes to, I've been to this cafe in Parliament. And there's a very big cafe where all the political staffers and politicians go to. And it's all digital. And they've got it set up. And their excuse is, it needs to be a bit of a conveyor line here because to get everyone through. So no flies on Bob though, because he's not in North Queensland. If he was in North Queensland, there'd be flies on him. Bob goes this week to pay for his lunch, and he pulls out a $50 note, and they wouldn't take it. He said, "You've got to take it. It's legal tender." And now, as it happens, the law doesn't oblige him to take it, but it is legal tender. They should take it. They were so insistent at first on not taking it. They were going to let him have his lunch for free. And Bob refused. He made him take it, and eventually the manager came along and agreed to take the cash. And then Bob took it to the chamber and raised this with the Speaker. Now, the way Parliament works is, this is interesting, the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, they actually have total authority, those individuals, total power over everything that happens in that building. And this was an easy fix. The Speaker of the House, Milton Dick, said, all right, the cafe has to accept cash. So this is a good victory for the, he got, as Richard and I talked about last week, he got the Reserve Bank doing the PR for the banks, coming up with all these studies that show, less cash use, we're going cashless, etc. No, there's a bigger fight back than that garbage PR, and Bob Katter's an example of it. So good on you, Bob. Be like Bob.
Be more like Bob. Now, and the final announcement is clear your calendars for the 14th and the 21st of February at 8:30 p.m. because Channel 7 will be screening over 2 sessions. Mr. Bates versus the Post Office.
Absolutely. So we discussed this the other week. Great show. It's still causing all sorts of political earthquakes in the UK. We need to get as many people to watch this as possible. Channel 7's trailer for it, and if we've got time, we'll put it up, actually shows you Channel 7 made sure they got this show because they've seen what a big impact it's had in the UK. So we need to get everyone here to watch it so that we can then make the political lessons from it stick in Australia, especially as relates to the crisis that Australia Post is in and what Australia Post is doing to the equivalent of these poor people in the UK that went to jail, and in Australia they're the licensees. I'm going to interview the licensed post office group as part of this. We're going to put up an interview so they can tell their story and see, because they're the ones who brought it to me. Look, we see all these parallels, right? And that's shocking that, every Australian should be absolutely flabbergasted when they see this show and then think, hang on, there's 2,850 small business licensees around Australia running post offices. I know my local one probably, and that person feels that show in the UK is similar to their plight. And that's shocking, and it's got to be addressed. And we've got a solution. Now, we can't change the attitude of Australia Post, but what we can do is fix the revenue problems at Australia Post, and in so doing, also fix the banking problems in Australia. Start a postal bank. It'll serve every community. There's 4,000 post offices in Australia. It'll serve every community, and the revenue from banking will actually support the delivery of postal services and the incomes of those licensees, etc. Right? And make the system work. It's a beautiful solution. Who wouldn't want it? The private banks. That's who wouldn't want it. And so when you see when you have an opportunity like this is going to get attention. Let's make sure it gets attention. Tell your local MP this week, call them up and say, or email them, say, you must watch Mr. Bates versus the Post Office on Channel 7 on the 14th and 21st of February. And just hammer everybody, especially local MP, and let's make this stick.
And share the link to the promo for the video around on social media if you can.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, now on to our first topic, which intersects all these issues. Architects of bail-in deposit theft behind RBA power grab. Now, of course, we're talking about the big issue of the day, which is that as a result of the independent RBA review, the Reserve Bank, our Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, wants to give away the government's, not just his power, but over all time, wants to give away the government's authority to have any say in what the Reserve Bank of Australia does.
Yep.
Now, this is a really important issue because of what Australians are going through at the moment with the record number of interest rate rises that we've seen by the RBA in the name of fighting inflation. So we want to give a bit of a backdrop first before we get into the guts of the story.
And remember, just for the figures you're about to give, this is the burden, the actual burden on households who didn't cause the inflation. They're the ones that the RBA is punishing to reduce the inflation. They didn't cause it, the RBA caused it. But they're punishing these households. And this is why we say this power by Chifley was invented for this time. So the government can say, listen, you academic, technocratic, disconnected bastards, you're not going to crush the life out of households around Australia just to meet your inflation targets. There's other ways to do it. Because Michelle Bullock says we only have one tool. No, she's lying. There's other ways to do it. Therefore, we, the government who represents the people, we're now telling you you're not going to do it. In fact, you're going to reduce rates and you're going to provide relief to those households because of everything to do with the cost of living. Nothing it compares to the burden of these interest rate rises.
And that is the very nature of the doctrine of austerity, is literally robbing from the poor to give to the rich, is you crush the people to draw money from them to keep the global financial system afloat, which really should be junked. Yeah, financial stability, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So we've got some figures on that crushing impact on mortgage holders. Firstly, I want to reference an article that came out today in the Sydney Morning Herald showing that mortgage holders are facing much greater inflation than anybody else, like retired people or whatever. ABS data, according to the Sydney Morning Herald, shows effective inflation rate for workers which generally are the people with mortgages, at 6.9%. So not the headline rate of whatever, 4 point something, but 6.9%. And it was 9% in September, mind you, they noted in the September quarter. So it's still nearly 7%. And Shane Wright from the Sydney Morning Herald said this: one of the main reasons for that is the Reserve Bank. And he went on to say that since December 2020, when the official cash rate was at 0.1%, the price of mortgage interest on working families has climbed by 109%.
And there's a chart here from the article, Elisa, that we can display, which shows the top 3 items in the economy that have increased in price, which we measure as, which is the cost of living, right? And the number one, by far, look at the middle one, is interest rate increases. But how can the burden of interest rate increases go up while the RBA says inflation's going down? Because the burden of interest rate increases is not included in the consumer price index that measures inflation. So they can pour it on. Those old medieval torture things where you put weights on the subject and you just screw more and more and more down on them. That's what they're doing to workers, and their screams don't measure in the inflation rate, right? This is fraud. Inflation is supposed to be about cost of living, and they are making the cost of living worse.
Now, you talked to Martin North about this from Digital Finance Analytics to try to get a measure of exactly how much is being siphoned out of the population to keep this financial bubble afloat per year.
Well, this is good.
Just from increased interest rate payments.
Exactly. So, because, look, just preface, interest rates needed to be normalised. The cash rate of 0.1% was rubbish, right? It needed to be normalised. But what we experienced was the RBA raising rates at the fastest clip in history, right? And this was just regardless of the burden on people, right? So Martin North did the calculations. The figure we're about to give is what all the indebted households in Australia collectively are paying per year just from over and above what they were paying in 2021, just from interest rate increases. And it's shocking. It is $49.52 billion extra for mortgaged owner-occupied homes, $49.52 billion extra, and for mortgage investors, a lot of whom are also, I'm not that sympathetic to investors per se, but a lot of them are just householders too who've been talking to becoming investors, an extra $20 billion there. So $70 billion extra just in interest payments are coming out of the indebted households of Australia. And compare that figure to what the government is touting as its cost of living tax cuts to give you relief. And what do they add up to a year? $20 billion. So it doesn't compare. What they're allowing the RBA and the banks to do to extract this pound of flesh from households completely dwarfs all the relief, etc., that they're providing.
Exactly. And the mortgage stress, according to Martin's latest figures, are at record levels at 50.5%. Rental stress is up to 73.5%. And part of that is from the fact that these investors are having to fork out so much more for interest rate payments on the mortgage that they're paying, so they're charging the renters more.
And it explains why you have these rental crises in places like Perth and Brisbane, because even though Perth and Brisbane property prices are not at the same level as Melbourne and Sydney, the burden on the investors who are negatively geared, they can't afford these investment properties anyway. They've been whacked so hard with these, they've had to pass them on, and rents have gone through the roof. It's unbelievable how bad it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's good that, as people might have heard in the headlines late last week, premiers of 3 states have demanded, and this was of course ahead of the RBA's interest rate decision on Tuesday, Stephen Miles from Queensland, Jacinta Allen from Victoria and Roger Cook from WA.
All Labor.
All Labor premiers demanded that the Reserve Bank start cutting interest rates to take the pressure off households, which is the way that a number of them put it. That's good. However, it's not aimed at the right, as we said in our lead article in the Australian Alert Service this week, as you wrote. Yeah. It's not aimed at the right person because...
They belled the wrong cat. Well, because before... the timing, I was really impressed with the timing though, because I don't know if they follow federal politics, these state premiers, but they rightly called for the RBA to cut rates. And then I'm thinking, hang on, your state premiers, especially you, Stephen Miles, the Premier for Queensland, your Labor colleague in your own state, Jim Chalmers, is the Treasurer. And right now, under the law, he has the power to order the RBA to do exactly what you're calling for. He has the power, but he's giving it away.
Right now.
He's in the process of ramming a bill through that will give it away, yet there you are calling for this thing to be done, and you're asking the RBA to do it. Whereas now is the time for you to be demanding Jim Chalmers not remove these powers, but use these powers.
And the Australians report on this, Patrick Commons he said this shows the growing appetite of premiers to break the convention that political leaders respect the independence of the RBA and avoid giving advice on monetary policy.
The only reason I've groaned is that it probably wasn't him, but whoever the sub-editor or whatever of this article was. The headline.
Yeah.
They called it, the Australian editors called what the premiers were doing, bullying the RBA. Bullying. Now, this tells you everything you need to know about Murdoch, right? Murdoch is every small business person and every blue-collar worker's best friend, and he'll side with you on all these cultural things that the Sky News crowd and whatever like to whip up, and all the woke stuff, and you'll think Murdoch's your best friend. But when it comes to economic policy, that bastard and his media machine worldwide, they sponsored every bit of evil economic policy that has destroyed Australia as an economy, the neoliberalism, the privatisation, the deregulation, the deindustrialisation of our manufacturing, etc. Murdoch actually participated in these foreign think tanks that came to Australia. He funded them, like the Centre for Independent Studies and the Institute of Public Affairs, that wrote these policies to gut our country. And here he's doing it again, weighing in to protect the poor RBA and the international banking network that it serves from the demands of the people for relief. That's the real Rupert Murdoch. Forget all the other stuff. That's the real Murdoch media right there. They are evil.
Now, the opposition Treasury spokesman Angus Taylor, who was cited in the article, was just as bad as Chalmers et al.
Because of course they go to these private schools and they get a brain transplant.
And he demanded that Jim Chalmers, quote, stand up to the Queensland Premier and stop him jawboning the RBA.
How dare an elected politician, how dare an elected politician tell the unelected technocrats at the RBA what to do?
Both sides are completely on the same page on this, but the exact correct response did come from a Member of Parliament, and that's Green Senator Nick McKim. We'll put these tweets up on the screen because on the 2nd of February, commenting on what the Premier's had to say, he said, Jim Chalmers has the power to overrule the RBA on interest rates under Section 11 of the RBA Act. Instead of using this power, the Treasurer is seeking to give it away in upcoming legislation. And again, he tweeted, inflation is coming down. It's clear the RBA went too far with rampant rate rises last year. Will Jim Chalmers use his power under Section 11 to cut rates and deliver urgent relief to renters and mortgage holders? Then on the 6th of February, following the rate decision, which of course the RBA kept rates stable, he said, given the RBA's poor decisions, Jim Chalmers needs to use his powers under the Reserve Bank Act and bring rates down. So he is hammering this, which is very, very good.
And of course, it's not surprising coming from Nick McKim, because Nick McKim has been one of the 3 senators over the last few years who's been belling the cat, to use that term again, on the fact that the RBA has powers it should be using. And the other one is Senator Gerard Rennick, and the third one is Senator Malcolm Roberts. So you've got a Liberal, One Nation and Green. Because, look, let me tell you something, and Gerard Rennick is a pretty unique Liberal. Outside of the major parties, I don't care what your stripes are in political terms. In my direct experience, Elisa, it's the people who are not in the major parties, and that includes the Greens. They're not beholden to the vested interests that run the financial system, like the Liberals always were, and Labor sold out to. Right? And so those guys find themselves on the same page, and Nick McKim said exactly the right thing.
And you referenced McKim and other senators challenging the RBA during Senate estimates, and I want to come to that now because we're going to talk a little bit about the submission that the Citizens Party made last week to this parliamentary inquiry into the RBA review and the government's endorsement of that to change the governing legislation of the Reserve Bank Act.
And before you go through that though, I want a disclaimer. I think what you're about to say is somewhat speculative, because I think you're defensive about the fact that I've accused you for the last month of being the reason Jim Chalmers is going to remove this power, because until Elisa wrote this submission,
previous submission, the one to the RBA review.
Yeah, but what Elisa has answered in this submission, which she's about to go through, is the question of where did this idea come from? Because until we establish where we know where it came from now, but until we did, it was a big mystery, because we couldn't tell how this proposal to remove the Treasurer's overrule power came about, because in all the submissions to the RBA review, only yours from last year, only yours had actually even identified the power and named it and called for it to be used. And so I've been joking it's Elisa's fault this is happening. She's proven I'm wrong.
And I don't think anyone was really conscious of it, of that existence of that power in current politics.
Probably. Well, Jane Hume was carrying on like she wasn't.
Well, she was, but that was after it was raised by Nick McKim and other senators. I only came across it looking at the whole question of inflation and how the RBA could fight inflation, and going back to look at the statements on the conduct of monetary policy and how over time, because the RBA was always meant to direct monetary policy in regard to three things, but the two fundamental things were full employment and inflation. And the third was the well-being of all the people of Australia, which they're legislating away now as well. But I was looking at the course of events where over time employment was basically given the flick by convention, not in any formal capacity, so that they just decided to have no regard for the employment of Australians and just fight inflation. And that was being done in the name of financial stability, which we'll talk about a bit more because we'll just go through a bit of what's in the submission.
No, just to be clear, I was joking about the disclaimer. We have now proven where this came from.
Yeah.
And this is the big story of the day, and it's why we have to fight it.
Yeah, well, so that's what I was going to say in regard to the senators from Greens, One Nation and the Liberal National Party who began pushing the Reserve Bank during Senate Economic Legislations Committee estimates discussions on why the RBA could print money to funnel into the banks through quantitative easing, but they couldn't print money to, for instance, put into building infrastructure. They could inflate the housing bubble. That was fine. Don't worry about inflation when it comes to pumping money out into housing and encouraging people to buy houses. You know, go out there. Our prime ministers and our treasurers were saying, go and buy a house, you know, buy a second house, buy a third house. That's all. Inflation was never an issue when it came to any of that. But when it came to the issue of putting money into the actual economy and the productive sector. The head of the RBA, Philip Lowe, used to go on about how productivity wasn't good enough. But when these senators challenged him, why can't the RBA direct credit into the real economy, which would help fight inflation by increasing productivity and getting the economy moving, putting people to work, paying their taxes, etc., they always bowed out and said, oh, well, I mean, ultimately Michelle Bullock was the one that said, look, if the government asked us to do such a thing, we would have to have a conversation about that. And of course, Section 11 power is what would come up in that case, because that Section 11 refers to in the event of a dispute between the RBA and the government over monetary policy and how to direct it, the government prevails.
Yep.
But what I wanted to mention is that it was March 2021 when these senators started to hammer the RBA on this question. By September of that year was when the International Monetary Fund and the OECD started pummeling the government. We need to have a review. Other countries have had a review of their monetary framework. And these authorities, particularly the IMF, started pushing that the RBA and its powers had to be subject to a review. So that's when it started. But what we have in our report is a timeline of events which show the broader scope of this, because one of the things that struck me about this process of reviews is that, of course, New Zealand had been subjected to a review in 2017, ahead of ours. And in terms of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand review, it had been recommended in the IMF's financial sector assessment of New Zealand in May 2017 in the context of bail-in policy. And of course, New Zealand had the most explicit bail-in regime in the world. We'll put up the graph that we've used a zillion times on this show, where it actually shows, you know, how people's deposits, actually says it in the text there on that graphic, can be taken to recapitalise banks. But as explicit as it was, the IMF at that point, May 2017, started pushing for it to be a proper legislated regime, starting off with implementing deposit insurance, because New Zealand had no deposit insurance, and the IMF said they were worried that that could cause a panic. Bail-in could cause a panic if there was no insurance for people's deposits.
And that's the IMF being true in a sense to its concern that it shares with the Bank for International Settlements and the Financial Stability Board, that financial stability comes first, trumps all other concerns. So because New Zealand was explicitly this bail-in regime, such that they even published that cartoon, but if people knew about, and most people in New Zealand did not know they were subject to that bail-in regime, right? But if people did, the IMF recognised, well, hang on, if banks start looking wobbly, and the people in New Zealand know that the banks, that they could pull their money out,
That's
and that
right.
would cause the crash. So you need deposit insurance.
Yes,
right?
exactly. But by June 2019, when the review was in full flow, one of the consultation documents for the RBNZ review made explicit the fact that deposit insurance was designed to smooth the way for a broader statutory bail-in power. And it said that would, quote, ensure that the Reserve Bank has broad enough powers to resolve a failing bank, such as a power to, quote, bail in unsecured debt to recapitalise a bank. And then if you look at the IMF consultation that just was concluded last year for New Zealand, they refer to the Deposit Takers Act, which enshrines this new deposit insurance legislation. And they say that Deposit Takers Act, quote, removes the requirement for ministerial consent to issue bail-in directions, thereby removing the current high threshold for using this tool to take corrective action. Because see, even as explicit as New Zealand's deposit bail-in regime was, it was a ministerial directive
to use it.
So the minister had to approve it. And so as the IMF went on to say, also in that Deposit Takers Act, it included an amendment to the Public Finance Act 1929 to address a gap in the current arrangements enabling the government to act quickly and use public funds in a financial crisis. So,
well, can I just make the point? So we're talking about New Zealand 2017, etc. Bail-in, just quickly, was a product of the 2008 crash, and governments like the Rudd government were part of the G20, and the G20 convened in Britain. They said, what can we do about this? And the G20 appointed the Bank for International Settlements subsidiary, the Financial Stability Board, to come up with a system that would supposedly avert future bailouts by governments, but keep financial stability. And that's where the idea of bail-in came from. They come up with this idea, well, the way to, if a bank starts to get wobbly, we'll take the deposits, because they are liabilities of the bank. We'll take
certain bonds.
And certain bonds, right? So we'll take the bank's liabilities, because if you in accounting terms, assets equals liabilities and equity, right? And any kind of company is broke if the assets are lower than liabilities. So they basically said, we need to come up with a way we can do a haircut to the liabilities,
shuffle things around,
and reduce them reduce them, and we're just going to have to take people's money, and maybe give it back eventually, but otherwise no guarantees, just take people's money. Some of it. And this was bail-in. Of course, it was first used in Cyprus in 2013. Now, from the beginning, though, Elisa, when we started looking at this and exposing it, we saw that these bodies, like the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, the Financial Stability Board, were insisting that this must be accompanied by total independence of the regulator, and depending on who the regulator is, but the Reserve Bank is part of the regulators, right? They are the chair of the Council of Financial Regulators in Australia. And they're insisting there must be total independence, because they knew if you have a situation where elected politicians have any say over whether their constituents' money is going to be stolen, they might blanch at that.
Oh, exactly.
And you need to have technocrats who will not blanch at that and will happily steal their money in the name of financial stability. And that was a theme from, you can see it in the documentation, from 2010, 2011 onwards. And now what we're seeing, what you've gone through in New Zealand, is them, in actually the case of the Reserve Bank, their equivalent of our RBA, saying this is how your system has to work.
So after less than a year after New Zealand started that review of its RBNZ in May 2017, Australia in February 2018 passed our first attempt at a bail-in law, and that gave the power to APRA to intervene in a financial crisis to put a bank into.
Well, by the way, by the time people are watching this, it'll be the sixth anniversary of that. The Valentine's Day.
Right. Yep.
Valentine's Day next week. I think is that Wednesday next week. Will be the sixth anniversary of the passage of that law.
Now, the IMF weren't happy though with that, and a year later they came back in several different reports, which are highlighted in our submission, where they said, look, the mandate for APRA has to be turned into one top item, and that's financial stability. Put that ahead of depositor protection, because financial stability is number one, etc. And they said we need to end the Treasurer being able to direct APRA and the Parliament being able to disallow APRA's prudential standards, APRA's rulings. A further IMF technical note said that APRA's decisions are subject to parliamentary scrutiny and could be disallowed by the Parliament. While this can be considered part of the checks and balances in the Australian democratic process, it could potentially lead, skipping ahead here, to the failure of key elements of APRA's prudential framework. It could potentially limit APRA's ability to achieve its primary objectives, being financial stability. And all the same period in some of these IMF technical documents, February 2019, the IMF also stated that the RBA's financial stability expertise had to be honed, had to be focused on. And that's, of course, the RBA now under this new legislation will be given a whole new mandate called financial stability. But if you look at the legislation, they don't even define what financial stability is. It's one sentence or a fragment of a sentence. So this is what, we're looking at now.
And before you go on, and if anyone thinks, well, maybe financial stability is important. You don't want to have bank runs. You don't want to have a repeat of 2008. Here's the part that gives the lie to the whole thing. The whole thing's a scam. Because from the beginning, in the post-2008 crisis period, when they were looking at this, all these international bodies and the governments had an alternative. And the alternative was bring in laws, especially a law, that would stop the banks doing the things that made them unstable in the first place. And that's what the Glass-Steagall law was. From 1933 to 1999, America had the most beautiful piece of regulation in the history of the world. A very simple law called Glass-Steagall, which was this. If you're a bank with deposits that you're holding other people's money in trust, you are not allowed to engage in speculation in the financial system like investment banks do. And if you're an investment banker and you want to speculate, you want to gamble, go your hardest, but you are not allowed to do it with deposits. It was that simple. It was super easy to police, and they repealed it in 1999. The gambling, so that the derivatives gamblers, the people who gamble in these most exotic bets, that they've made movies about the 2008 crisis about this stuff, right? So that those guys could grab the public's deposits, the American public's deposits, the Australian public's deposits, and just ramp up their gambling. And it had taken derivatives, I think the first derivatives trade was something like 1986, 87, and it took 13 or 14 years for global derivatives trading to grow to $100 trillion, right? Sorry, 100, so it went from 14 years to go to $100 trillion by 2000. That was when they repealed Glass-Steagall. And then in the next 5 years or 6 years, it went from $100 trillion to $700 trillion, right? All fueled by people's deposits. And so the obvious thing after the crash, that very few organisations, we had predicted it, right? The obvious thing was to bring back the law that had provided real financial stability all those years by constraining the gambling of the banks. And these masters of the universe who have come up with this scheme to make you pay for the bank's sins refuse to do it. Do not touch the banks. Make the people wear the burden.
Just a final note on financial stability if you needed more evidence. For our Australian Alert Service this week, I just reviewed a paper that came out in September last year called Survival of the Biggest Large Banks and Financial Crises. And of course, they reviewed the fact that through every crisis, the big banks get bigger because they get bailed out. They swallow up and merge with the smaller banks.
They get bailed out though.
So that then is a continuing self-fulfilling cycle. And in regard to financial stability, this is the quote from the report. It says, large banks have been at the epicentre of financial instability and risk-taking throughout history. And they look at 17 countries over 150 years. It's a really stunning data set that they've pulled together.
Elisa, some viewers will probably even make a comment about this, so I'm preempting it. But it's a good point to make now. There's a very famous financial expert named Professor Richard Werner, and he points out how the contrast to everything we're talking about is the way Germany's banking system developed around these small banks right? All over the place. Every town had its own bank kind of thing. And now they've got some big banks as well, like Deutsche Bank. But the real strength of Germany's financial system was these small banks. And one of the things that makes it strong is if one small bank gets into trouble, it doesn't set off a knock-on effect with all the others, right? And because they're local banks, so they don't get into trouble because they're serving the local community. It's a much better form of financial stability than what they've acknowledged in this report you just talked about. What we want to do with the postal bank is bring back a government bank, right, to operate through post offices, which will be very strong, but also encourage the small banks of Australia to, because they're very good at providing a service, the small banks that are in Australia, encourage them and take away all the props for the big four banks that are allowing them to just exploit people, as we're seeing.
Now, I neglected to mention before we move to the next topic that the one reference in the RBA reviews process, and they not only took public submissions, they held various consultations, including things like focus groups and surveys of economists and expert panel consultations, and they invited expert opinions from 5 or 6 leading economists. So one of those economists wrote a paper in which he didn't actually use the term Section 11, but under the subhead potential override of policy decisions, and this is Professor Andrew Levin, he's from one of the Ivy League colleges at Dartmouth in the US, but he is a regular visiting scholar at the IMF, so that brings you into, and the IMF of course works very closely with the Financial Stability Board on all of this. The IMF don't do it alone. The Financial Stability Board is based at the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, which came out of the process during and after World War II, to create a form of financial government that would dictate decisions to all nation states around the world on such matters. So under this override of policy decisions subhead, Andrew Levin said that even a veiled threat could substantially undermine the central bank's statutory independence, and therefore demanded that the board's monetary policy decisions should not be subject to any potential override by government officials.
And one other thing about his CV is he was on the Federal Reserve Board for 20 odd years. In this period where the Federal Reserve presided over this explosion of bank gambling in America and kept bailing them out, it was called the Greenspan put. Greenspan encouraged them to the banks to speculate, and every time they get into trouble, he'd lower interest rates even further to help bail them out from their own speculation. Yeah. That guy was on the board during that whole period. He's an example of the mentality of, no, give the banks everything they want, total unbridled speculation and gambling. The people are going to pay, and we have to constrain those pesky governments, those democratically elected governments. Even though we go to war and kill people in other countries in the name of democracy, no, when it comes to real power, yeah, we don't want that.
But that was
banks first.
But his paper was the only reference to this. There was literally, as you foreshadowed
Except for
before,
you.
there were, apart from our submission, but there was no mention ahead of the review about Section 11. There was nothing in the terms of reference to that review. There was nothing in the issues paper. There was nothing in the media, nothing in the public submission and consultation process apart from those 2 incidences. The only thing that presaged it was the senators pressing the RBA in the Senate. So the threat that the Parliament, that the elected government would override the FSB and Bank for International Settlements monetary directives, that was very real. So this is why this is going to be a big fight.
The global banking dictators are saying we're taking away this power before more people. The numbers of people in the Australian Parliament demanding it be used grow enough they'll actually use it.
Yeah. All right, so stay tuned for more on that as this inquiry proceeds. And on to our next topic. Assange's persecution is all about protecting lies. And so Julian Assange is rotting in jail because he told the truth, told truth to power, and actually also threatened in a grave way the wars that have been accepted and which Australia has gone along with and which are continuing to this day and threatening World War III, nuclear World War III. Now, Assange's final appeal against the order that he be extradited will be heard in London's High Court on the 20 to 21st of February.
So two weeks away.
That's a critical date. Now, on the 6th of February, the UN Special Rapporteur, who is an Australian, Dr. Alice Jill Edwards, has actually urged the British government to halt Assange's extradition due to grave concerns about his mental health and potential exposure to torture. And the concerns about his mental health, when you see the reports, are getting obviously worse all the time because of the situation that he's in. So we're going to talk about some lies to contrast to how the liars get treated as opposed to the truth tellers. But I want to mention that if people can get along to any of the upcoming events or support in other ways, we need to have a real outpouring of support for Assange in this next couple of weeks. There might be more events, you can do searches, but in Adelaide on the 13th of February is the premiere of The Trust Fall at the Capri Cinema in Goodwood, and that's at 7 p.m.
And that's an important new film that tells the Assange story, The Trust Fall.
And then in Melbourne on the 18th of February is a rally in support of Freedom for Assange, which is also a Gaza ceasefire rally at the State Library at 12 p.m. And then the big event is in Melbourne, but also available for people to attend online on the 9th of March. That's Night Falls in the Evening Lands, the Assange Epic. And you can find more out about that on nightfalls.info. And that's a full day event, 9 till 5.
Now, if you're in a position to attend that event in person, absolutely do. You've got to register and there's a cover charge to help pay for the event to go ahead. The Citizens Party is actually helping to sponsor that event. So,
but there's a great lineup of speakers.
Oh, exactly.
It'll be a great day.
Hosted by Mary Kostakidis, international speakers, etc. We will be there. I'll be there. You'll be there. Other people from our office will be there attending on the day. So if you're in any position around Australia, be in Melbourne at that time. If you're in Melbourne, definitely organise yourself to get along on that day to show your support and participate.
But
in
you
the
can
event.
get a ticket online to
Well,
watch
that's the
it
other
online.
thing. Make sure, if you can't, get a ticket online. Participate online. Look, the Australian government has the reason the Australian government has gone through the motions, at least on Assange, is because they know they cannot ignore the enormous public support, but the public needs to keep demonstrating that support, right? And this is a really good way to do that.
Now, two examples you wanted to give by way of contrast.
Well, exactly. What did Julian Assange say? Wars are started
By
lies. Peace can be achieved with the truth.
Yeah.
Right. That's what motivated him. And in fact, in 2022, I was at an Assange rally in Canberra in front of Parliament House, and Andrew Wilkie. And if you know Andrew Wilkie's story, he worked at the National Security Agency of Australia, Office of National Assessments, and he was one of the few people at the time of the Iraq War saw the lies and resigned in protest over them. And he inspired the young Julian Assange. And he told the story. He was at an event here in Melbourne, I think it was, and this white-haired guy came up to him and said, I'm thinking you could use my computer skills to start a system whereby people can anonymously publish leaks that can expose all this stuff, and that became WikiLeaks, right? And he's been, and they're determined to crush him for it. So, but we're seeing lies all the time. And there's two war fronts that we've been concerned about. The people who want to start a war with China, and of course you've got this terrible situation in Israel, Gaza at the moment. So the two lies that need to be mentioned that we're going to talk about. So one of them this week was the news that the Chinese courts have sentenced what the media called an Australian writer or an Australian academic or an Australian father, Yang Hengjun, to death by execution, but basically commuted after 2 years to life imprisonment, and it's a standard thing. To show you how standard it is, I'll put this on the screen. I had to comment about this because this week they also sentenced to exactly the same sentence, death by execution and commuted to life imprisonment, one of the top bankers in China who was caught corruptly using his position as a banker to feather his own nest. And so our media was telling you to hate China because there's such brutal people doing this to an Australian. How do you feel about him doing it to bankers? Anyway, put that aside. Here's what they didn't tell you. And I really reacted to this because Australian writer, Australian father. No. First of all, he's a dual citizen. And what that means is China doesn't recognise his Australian citizenship. That's just how China operates. If you can be an Australian citizen, you can be a Chinese Australian living in Australia and take up Australian citizenship. But if you want to keep your Chinese citizenship, China thinks you're their citizen. So that's one. Two, he's not just any writer. This man was a Chinese spy. He was a spy for China.
For Chinese military intelligence.
For 14 years, the MSS. He was their spy, right? And then he was stationed in Washington, and I suspect he was turned by Western intelligence agencies because then he became an anti-China person, quit the MSS, left China, etc. He became a writer. What does he write? He writes stories, spy fiction, where the hero has his name, Yang, and is a double agent. And there's a WikiLeaks in 2009 published a cable where the CIA was writing about this guy saying, we think he is a spy because he actually says only people who know espionage should write spy novels, and that's a good hint, he's probably a spy, right? This is a CIA cable about him. In Australia, he's really close to the anti-China crowd who are also very close to ASIO, our spy agency, right? They are his friends in Australia, including people like John Garno, who Paul Keating called out in 2019 as the man in Malcolm Turnbull's office, the ASIO plant in Malcolm Turnbull's office, who had turned Australia on this anti-China thing.
Yes.
And that's when Keating famously said, when the intelligence agencies are running your foreign policy, the nutters are in charge, right? That's who this Yang's best friend in Australia is, essentially John Garno. But here's the most interesting bit. Why would this guy go back to China? He flew back to China in 2019 and got arrested. Right? Well, if an American spy defected from America and went to another country and then flew back after a while, the CIA is not just going to say, oh, good on you, mate. Something's going to be done to him too, right? But anyway, so why did he go back? This is it's a really murky story. It's really curious. The guy who took him to the airport, he literally dropped him off at the airport. It was a friend of his, his name is Mike and Meng. Wai-Ken Meng. He's from an organisation called China Free Press. Now, we wrote about this in 2020. Melissa Harrison wrote this series of articles. We talked about this guy in 2020. China Free Press, which has received substantial funding from US government-funded regime change agitator, the National Endowment for Democracy, and that's a CIA cutout. And Meng is also the founder of Boxin, a US-based Chinese language publication which the Chinese government accuses of trying to organise a Tiananmen Square 2 back in 2011, a thing called the Jasmine Revolution. So that man drove Yang to the airport to put him on the plane to go to China. And they want us to believe, oh, he's just a poor, misunderstood, persecuted Australian writer. No. This guy he's a spook, every way you want to cut it. And do not automatically assume that when the Chinese government accuse someone of spying, they're lying. And the other proof of that is from 2019 onwards, we had this saga where the Chinese held 2 Canadians. After Canada arrested the founder of the daughter of Huawei at America's behest, China arrested 2 Canadians and accused them of spying. Eventually, China released these guys back to Canada after Canada let the founder of Huawei go. What's happened in the last few months? One of those Canadian guys has sued the other one for making him spy. He's admitted he was a spy. What China accused him of, he has admitted it. Do not assume that when China makes these accusations, they're making it up, right? So the Australian press, the typical warmongering press, are just lying about this to try and use what they're trying to do. And if you look at it closely, the Albanese government is making baby steps to improve the relationship, and these people are trying to sabotage it at every turn. All right, that's one. The other one is much sadder. We're running out of time, but look, there was this. When I say it's much sadder, I'm not trying to diminish what's happened to Yang, but the Israel-Gaza thing is a terrible situation. Nearly 30,000 civilians have died, 11,000 plus children. There's 1,000 children they report have had operations without anaesthetic. I mean, it's totally bad. It's awful. And October 7 was the date of the Hamas attack, which, by the way, we're going to do more on that in the future. There's a lot of claims about that have been debunked. But anyway, the attack happened, and October 9 in Australia was when the pro-Palestine community, the Muslim community, etc., rallied at the Opera House in protest. And what they were protesting was the fact that by October 9, the Israelis had already started hitting back. More than 400 Palestinians were already dead. They also were upset that there's terrorist attacks against Arab countries all the time, and the Western countries like Australia never put the colours of those Arab countries on their monuments. But if it's a white country, or it's Israel, in this case, we're going to put the Israeli flag on the Opera House. That's what they were protesting. And people would be very familiar with, there was a claim, because the media jumped on this straight away, there was a claim that the protesters started chanting, "Gas the Jews." Gas the Jews. And thanks to the hard work of some hardy investigators, they've proven, and the New South Wales police have actually come out and confirmed the footage that was released that claimed to be saying "gas the Jews" just wasn't true. It didn't say "gas the Jews" at all. It was saying "where's the Jews?" And the reason they were saying "where's the Jews" is because the New South Wales police had let them have their protest and then cleared them out and said, "You've got to leave because now the Israeli flag is going to be put on the Opera House, and Jewish people are going to come here." And so, there's high tensions, etc. And some of them got upset at being asked, they had to leave, and they're saying, "Where's the Jews? Where's the Jews?" Right? They weren't on a Jew hunt or anything like that, but this is what was twisted into the worst possible thing of "gas the Jews." And now it's now been exposed. The truth has come out of what it actually was. The reason we highlight this is you've got to think, why do people want to promote these kind of lies, right? Why do they? Because the more they can make, in the case of Yang, the Chinese government, seem like utter monsters, or in the case of this "gas the Jews" thing, the Palestine, the pro-Palestine community in Australia seem like utter monsters, the more it justifies what we're doing, which is sitting back, and we accuse the Chinese of genocide for sending young Uyghurs to TAFE College to learn a trade so they don't get radicalised. We call that genocide. But we're sitting on our hands and watching the mass slaughter of babies and children in Gaza, and we're saying, Israel has a right to defend itself. So, and the thing to reflect on is that if you keep having that double standard, eventually it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because people will snap, the rage will spill over, and all sorts of things will happen. And it's up to us at these times to say, no, we have to fight for the truth, because it's the only way that we're going to be able to identify who the bad actors are, who the good actors are, achieve a pathway to peace, and finally be able to stop this stuff.
So help us circulate the truth, get the alert service, subscribe, follow the links below for more information on all of these stories and the various campaigns that we've mentioned, and things like the link to the post of a story on Channel 7 circulate.
And get everybody to make submissions to the RARAT committee on anyone who's affected by bank closures. We'll have the link below. Make submissions.
So that's the show for this week. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Elisa.
Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.